Welcome to this second lecture in our week in talking about metaphysics and things that have to do with time. In the first lecture this week, we talked about different theories of time, and now we're going to return to some things I talked a little bit about at the beginning of our section on metaphysics, and focus in on some puzzles and issues with what's called the persistence through time. That is, so like, what is it for something to exist at a time and at another time, and for it to change, from one time to another? So I mean, it seems like clear as day that things change, right? At one point you were a baby, and now you're fully grown. You're an adult. At one point, maybe you have a car, and at one point that car was new. Now that car is older. It has gotten dirtier, more rust, more miles on it. It's had parts replaced, etc. Um, but what is it for something to change, and what is it for something to stay the same? One philosopher once said that that it wasn't possible to step into the same river twice. Basically implying that because the water that moves through a river is constantly changing, that it was never that that really it was never the same river, because of the water. Now that seems a little bit less than plausible. I think like you can step into the Mississippi River more than once; it'll be the same river. But an interesting question is, well, clearly the river has changed in a way from one time to another. So in a sense, he's right. You're not stepping into exactly the same thing. It's definitely got new properties, and things do change over time. So how and in what way, and how should we think about things being the same thing but changing over time? Now, remember, this sort of takes seriously Leibniz's law, and Leibniz's law, or at least the identity or the indiscernibility. It's a version of Leibniz's law that's often called the indiscernibility of identicals, meaning that things that are identical are indiscernible with respect to the properties that they have. Remember, this concerns numerical identity, and so Leibniz's law says that if two things are identical, so take A and B here, if two things are identical, that is, if they're one and the same thing, then all of A's properties are also B's properties, and vice versa. The idea here is just something like, look, A and B we can use to name the exact same thing, and so one and the same thing. If that's true, then A's properties are B's properties, and B's properties are A's properties, because it's just one thing that we're talking about that has all these properties. Right. So if A has some property P, then B also has that property, and vice versa. Now, remember, we're talking about numerical identity. So this is the same shirt issue, right? If we're talking about two people wearing the same shirt, we're talking about two people wearing one shirt in this case, right? The numerically the same shirt. Whereas it's always possible for two people to wear the same shirt with respect to the qualities of the shirt, right? It's qualitatively identical. That is, it's not the same shirt, but it's a shirt that has all the same properties, or not all the same properties, but all the same qualitative properties. It looks the same, it's the same size, so on and so forth, right? So in this case, you can have two things that are qualitatively the same, whereas in this case, you can only have one thing that is numerically identical with itself. All right, but what about time, right? So think about Leibniz's law and think about time, right? Um, as a child, I was at one point only 3 feet tall, right? But as an adult, I am now 6 feet tall. So what gives? Doesn't this violate Leibniz's law? Remember, so Leibniz's law says if A has property P, then B has property P. Well, in this case, Kyle has the property of being 3 feet tall and no taller. And then also, I have the property of being 6 feet tall and no shorter, right? those seem like incompatible properties, right? When I was a child, I didn't have the property of being 6 feet tall. Now I do not have the property of being 3 feet tall. So is it the case that I am not identical with myself as a child? That me now, in some way, is just not me when I was a kid? That seems implausible, right? It seems like no, there's got to be something that gives. There's got to be something that holds fixed. There's got to be something about change over time that allows individuals to be the same individual, even though things are different. Things have changed in some way. So certainly I am different than I was when I was a child, right? Certainly there's lots of properties about me that have changed, right? I've grown up, I've gotten smarter, I've gotten taller, I've been able to grow facial hair. I've stopped living with my parents. But there's also a sense in which I'm the same person, right? I have, I'm psychologically continuous with my childhood self. I still have a lot of the same likes and dislikes. I have the same name, right? I'm in a sense the same person. So there has got to be a sense in which I'm identical to the child that was 3 feet tall, back in the day. So this is the kind of identity that we're interested in across time, right? So what is it that makes something the same thing over time through change? Now, remember, we talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago. There's a distinction between accidental and necessary properties, and you can think about it like this. So, necessary properties, or certain kinds of essential properties, are the kinds of properties that things need or things have, and those properties make them the kind of thing that they are, right? So, like a cat is essentially a mammal. Being a mammal is part of what it takes to be a cat. It's part of what makes a cat a cat. Um, but then there are also accidental properties like, location, or whether or not you're inside of, like France, like, size, it seems like an accidental property. Like, uh, a cat could be slightly bigger or slightly smaller than it is, and it would still be the same cat, right? Changing those properties doesn't take away from the being of the thing itself. Those properties are accidental, they're contingent. So take the example here of Socrates. Socrates sitting and Socrates standing. Is Socrates sitting the same as Socrates standing? Well, I mean, in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. If sitting was somehow a necessary property of Socrates, then to move from a sitting position to a standing position, you'd change the being. It'd be a new thing. It'd be Socrates changing some of his necessary properties, and that's not possible. You can't change your necessary properties or a thing's necessary properties without stopping that thing from existing. So if Socrates is something that is necessarily sitting, then changing Socrates from Socrates sitting to Socrates standing, you would, Socrates sitting would cease to exist. But luckily, Socrates himself isn't Socrates sitting, right? In the sense that, like, being a seated thing isn't a necessary property of Socrates. It's just an accidental property of Socrates, right? Socrates can sit and Socrates can stand. Standing and sitting are not essential properties of Socrates. They're things that he can do, and he can still be the same individual, even if he's standing or if he's sitting. So, these properties are orthogonal to what it takes to be Socrates. And so they're not really things that are that interesting in a certain sense when we're worried about identity across time. Surely these kinds of properties do play a certain kind of role, but we can think about it. We can think about them in ways that are like related to time. And here's what I mean. Socrates cannot sit and stand at the same time. But Socrates at a certain time can be sitting, and Socrates at a certain time can be standing. And so we can understand what it is for Socrates to be sitting with respect to his sitting at a particular time for a particular duration of time. And similarly, we can understand what it is for Socrates to be standing at a time for a particular duration of time. So, in a way, when we're worried about these accidental properties, we should be thinking about them as properties that occur to a thing, at a certain period of time. And in a sense, they're relative to those to that period of time. A necessary property is something that's going to apply to something always and for all times and given all possible situations, right? So Socrates is a human person. He's not a cat, right? It seems like being a human person is essential to what Socrates is. Um, if you somehow zapped Socrates with a magic wand and turned him into a cat, you really wouldn't have turned him into a cat. You kind of ceased his existence, right? He stopped being a person. He's now a cat. It seems like, if being a person is an essential property of Socrates, he's gone out of existence, and a cat has popped into existence at that time. Being a person is something that is not an accidental property of Socrates, and so it's not something that is, in a certain sense, time indexed to him. It is not something that is, a property that he has relative to a particular period of time. Now, what is it for something to exist over time? Well, one way of thinking about this is through this notion of what we will call persistence. What it is for something to persist over time is for it to exist at various times, right? So existence is the kind of thing that everything does, right? Everything exists. There's nothing that really doesn't exist in a sense, right? Even things that we would normally say don't exist exist in a sense. I think, right? At the very least, they're parts of our imagination or fictional characters that we read about in books. But when something persists over time, and here we can restrict ourselves to talking about material objects, things that are physical in a certain sense, just to pare down what we're worried about. Let's just talk about physical objects and think about what it is for a physical object to persist over time. So take like a chair or a table or a human being or a cat or a statue or a ship, something like that. So what is it for something to persist over time? Well, it's for it to exist at various times. And so now here I've got these two little timelines. A, can keep existing over time. Let's just say, from left to right, we've got T1 through T4. A, as long as it exists at various times, that is to say that A persists from the first moment to its last moment. It comes into existence at the first A, and it goes out of existence at the last A. Now, one interesting thing about persistence is that it's also possible for things to go into and come back in, go out of and come back into existence, right? So not necessarily like human beings or anything like that, but like your car or your watch or certain kinds of things that can be taken apart and put back together or obliterated and somehow reconstituted. So sometimes things can go out of existence, right? So suppose your watch gets you've got to get it fixed, and so the watchmaker takes all of the parts of your watch apart. So your watch came into existence at the first A here at the bottom, and then at the second A, the watchmaker has taken your watch completely apart and has it laid out piece by piece all over his work table. It seems plausible to say at that point that your watch no longer exists, right? It's not put together. There is no watch there. There's just a lot of watch parts. But once he puts the things back together in the right order, in the right way, thereby fixing your watch, it seems like your watch comes back into existence. And insofar as your watch then continues to exist, it can exist at different times. And the idea here is that this is your watch now is something that persists over time because it exists at various times. It's true that it exists at various times, even if it ceases to exist for a short period of time. Now, Persistence over time is one of these puzzles in general. Like, so change over time is a big puzzle in general. It's like how is it possible for something to be the same thing and yet change? But sort of the biggest puzzle that we've come across that's related to persistence at this point is the ship of Theseus puzzle. Now remember, the ship of Theseus puzzle goes like this. So take this ship over here at the beginning. We'll call it A. Ship A is the ship of Theseus. And the ship of Theseus is made up of, say, 100 planks. We'll just, stipulate that for, ease of giving the example. And at time T1, right at the beginning here of the ship of Theseus example, the ship is made up of 100 planks, and then it goes on, and at time T2, it's still made up of 100 planks, but one of the planks has started to rot, or, it's really not necessarily rotten. It's just like starting to go. And so they're going to replace it. So they pull off the plank and they store it in a barn, and they put a new shiny new plank in its place. And then time goes on and the same thing happens. You get a second plank, you put the plank in the barn, and another shiny new plank in the boat. And again, so on and so on and so on, until eventually you get all of the planks of the ship of Theseus have been replaced, and all of the old planks are in the barn. And now you have ship B here, right? Ship B is, in a certain sense, continuous with the ship of Theseus. It has been in exactly the same place, right? Like it's movement and continuity with respect to it's gone around the world in the same place over time. So it seems like, plausibly speaking, if we didn't do what we're about to do, ship B would just be the ship of Theseus, right? Like, it would be clear as day that this ship still is the ship of Theseus. It's totally possible for something to replace its parts and still be the same kind of thing that it is, right? I mean, supposedly human beings, it works just like this for you and I, right? Like, our cells die and get replaced, and the atoms in our bodies, we shed them and they're replaced by new atoms. And supposedly every I think this is like a myth, but supposedly every 7 years, or about every 7 years, every bit of our body has been fully replaced. And that doesn't mean that I'm somehow some new thing. It seems like I'm the same thing. Well, okay, so if it weren't to be what we were about to do, if we didn't do it, ship B would seem to have a clear-cut case of being the ship of Theseus. But we're going to do something, right? So I'm going to go to the barn where we stored all of the extra planks that we took off the ship of Theseus, and I'm going to, within that barn, put all the planks back together in just the way that that they were originally put together, and I'm going to reconstitute, maybe to send to a museum or something like that, the original ship of Theseus, right? So now I've got ship C here, and it's, built out of the same planks as A, the original ship of Theseus over here. Some of them have some wear, some of them have been sitting around for a long time in the barn, but still, it's enough stuff to build a ship. The ship would be seaworthy. It's not that, it would sink, because none of the planks when they were pulled off were rotted through or gross or anything yet. So now, what comes of this, right? So this is supposed to be here at time, we'll call this like T5. Time T5, both B and C exist, and both B and C are ships, right? They're both boats that are seaworthy. And both B and C seem to have a claim as being to being the original ship of Theseus, right? The differences here are in some way that, so B is in a way like causally continuous with the ship of Theseus, right? It's been moving through the ocean in the same way that the ship of Theseus was. But C also seems to have this claim to be the ship of Theseus because it's composed of the original parts of the ship of Theseus. Now, ship B and ship C clearly aren't the same thing. They're not identical. And so if we assume that the ship of Theseus is one ship and can't be two ships, then it seems like we're stuck, right? What is the ship of Theseus? Is the ship of Theseus ship B? Is it ship C? Or is it neither of those things? Is it just a different ship altogether? Somehow, the change from the ship of Theseus here, to B, the ship of Theseus ceased to exist and a new ship kind of came to be. Or down here, right, is somewhere between ship A and the whole disassembly, putting the ship back together into ship C. We didn't actually rebuild the ship of Theseus. We rebuilt a whole new ship C here, which is like a replica of the ship of Theseus using the same parts, but it's not the ship of Theseus, right? So interesting set of questions. Like, this is a big puzzle with respect to what it is for a thing to be the same thing over time, right? It seems like, from the ship of Theseus to B, that's kind of like our normal line for most things. This case down here is a little bit trickier to think about, but it seems like an interesting set of questions. All right, so now what is it for something to exist across time? The ship of Theseus will come back up, but I just put it out there as like a way to helpful way to think about, like, here we got this big puzzle and we want to try and solve it, and it's interesting to think about persistence with respect to the puzzle to see if there are any interesting or good ways of solving it. So what is it again for something to exist across time? Well, common sense seems to tell us that when things exist, what it is for a material object to exist is for a whole three-dimensional thing to be composed of physical stuff, and for it to be somewhere in space. And then what is it for it to exist across time? Well, it's for this three-dimensional object to exist at various times, right? It's I've got my pen in front of me now, and then I've got my pen in front of me now, and I just transferred it from my left hand to my right hand, and time passed, and there's this one pen, and it's a physical three-dimensional object, and it existed at two different times, and so we say that it has persisted through time. Now, of course, this pen was at one point brought into existence, right, by the pen manufacturing company. They put together all of these little plastic pieces and put the ink in the inkwell, and they put it all together, and it came into existence. And then eventually, this piece of plastic, all of these parts of this pen will slowly decay and become destroyed, or I could throw it into a fire or something like that, and it would cease to be, right? The pen would cease to be, it would stop being a pen at the very least if it became this big melted hunk of garbage. And at that point, the thing would no longer exist at that time. So that's what common sense tells us. So how can we kind of capture the commonsensical way of thinking about things in a philosophical view? And this is what I think of as the most consistent or plausible sounding commonsensical view of what it is for something to persist through time. And this is the view that's called Endurantism. Endurantism is the idea that objects endure time. That is, they move through time, enduring as the objects that they are. So on Endurantism, an ordinary material object like a chair or a table or maybe a person or a cat or a dog persists through time by being wholly present at various times across time, right? So yeah, right. So take your watch. Your watch is an ordinary material object, and it persists by being wholly present at various times across time, right? At a certain point in time, it stops persisting because it's been taken apart, and it's not really, in a sense, wholly present, even though all the parts might in a sense be present, but the thing itself isn't a unified three-dimensional object at that time. But then it comes back into existence, hopefully, we think, and so it continues to endure. These things can be broken up, but something exists if it's wholly present at a certain time, and then at a later time without it being pulled apart and reconstituted in between. That is what it is for an object to persist through time on the Endurantist view. It's for it to endure across time. These objects that endure across time are three-dimensional objects, and they exist in time, right? The fourth dimension is just the mode in which these objects exist, right? So they take up spatial regions, and they take up spatial regions through time. This view seems really, really plausible and really, really straightforward. But so far, it hasn't helped us with the ship of Theseus at all. Remember, why? Well, because this doesn't tell us which object the ship of Theseus is at time t5, right? This doesn't tell us whether or not the ship of Theseus is ship B or ship C, right? Because all this tells us is that, material objects persist by being wholly present at various times across time. That's totally consistent with the ship of Theseus being either B or C, or it being neither of them, right? Because the ship of Theseus could have just gone out of existence at a certain point, while transferring planks into becoming, or while that whatever that thing is became ship B, or before it got put together and became ship C. Now, there are various problems for Endurantism. So besides the fact that it just hasn't helped us yet with the ship of Theseus problem, there are various problems for Endurantism. And these kind of problems come up over and over again in philosophy. And one of them we already talked about, the statue and clay problem. And so while this view is rather plausible sounding, it's worth thinking about these puzzles and seeing if, thinking about if it can tackle these puzzles, or whether or not we should change our mind and not be Endurantists. One of these puzzles, it sure does seem like in the real world that 3D material objects exist. And that there's, whenever you've got a 3D dimensional material object, like your water bottle or your laptop, that there's only one of them that's located exactly where it is. Right? Look at your computer in front of you and think, how many things are there right there? And if you answer more than one or less than one, in a normal context where you're talking to somebody, they might think you're crazy, right? So it seems like, where your computer is just where your computer is. There's one three-dimensional object there. However, it seems that there might be more. So let's look at these two case studies. The case first of the statue and the clay, which we've talked a little bit about already, and then the other case, the case of cat Tibbles and the cat part Tib. So could two objects really be coincident? Let's imagine a timeline in which you have a lump of clay. You go to the craft store and you buy a lump of clay, and you take that lump of clay and you form it, right? So at T1, you have a lump of clay. You form it into this handsome, face sculpture thing. You get it. You basically, and you've got a statue, but you never get around to actually like kilning the thing. I don't know, because maybe there's no good kiln around or something, nothing big enough, or I don't know. And then, so that's at time T2, you've got a statue. And then at time T3, either something happens to the clay or you just get tired of it. And so you smash the statue back into a big amorphous lump. Now, on this timeline, given this example, a couple of things seem totally true, right? The first thing is that there is no statue at time T1 or time T3. Now, of course, so when you buy the lump of clay from the craft store, you're not buying a statue, right? If you were buying a statue, it'd be more expensive. But no, you're just buying a lump of clay. So at time T1, the statue didn't exist, but the lump of clay does exist. Similarly at time t3, right? The statue, or at the very least, the statue that you had made that ended up being the statue of t2 is no longer going to be there, right? I mean, you can, as an artist, always be like, oh, look, I took this statue that was, and I mashed it up, and now I've got a new statue. Cool, right? So maybe at time t3 there's another statue there, and that statue is just looks like a lump of clay. But I mean, at the very least, the statue, the specific statue, this handsome face statue, is no longer in existence at time t3. You don't have this thing going at time t3, but you do still have a lump of clay. There's a lump of clay that exists in front of you. Now, question: is there a lump of clay at time t2? I mean, certainly there's a statue, and the statue, I would say, is made up of this lump of clay. It's the same lump of clay from time t1 to time t3, and at time t2, it's still the same lump of clay. It's just been formed in a particular way to make a statue. And so now there's an issue, though. A statue, if it can, come into existence and go out of existence at different times than the lump of clay, then the statue and the lump of clay can't be the same thing, right? According to Leibniz's law, if one thing is the same thing as another thing, then that thing has all and only the same properties as the other thing. Well, in this case, that's not the case. That's just not true, right? The lump of clay and the statue do not exist at the same times. So they have different properties, right? I mean, the lump of clay seems to exist at all of time t1, t2, and t3, whereas the statue clearly only exists at time t2. And so what gives? It seems like we've got two different, coincident, three-dimensional physical objects, both a statue, which is obviously a physical thing, and a lump of clay, which is also obviously a physical thing. Now, but this seems sort of strange, right? At least in a sense, given the view of Endurantism. Endurantism says that a thing exists as long as it's as long as it exists at various times. So, I mean, doesn't it seem like there should just be one thing, one thing that's been variously formed in certain ways? Maybe you're thinking, oh, you know what? We just call lumps of clay statues when we've put them into various forms, but really all that there is a lump of clay at time t2, and it's just called a statue. I mean, maybe that's true, but still, it seems like a statue is a statue, and the thing that's there is no longer a statue when it goes back into just being a lump of clay. So, questions: can there ever really be multiple material objects in one place at the same time? I mean, on a kind of naive view, thinking about physics, you get this answer: no, of course you can't have two material objects in the same place at the same time, right? You couldn't have like two atoms in the same place at the same time. That would violate the laws of physics. We've got, the strong force and the weak force. We have gravity that pulls things together, but it doesn't put them in the same place. We have the strong force and the weak force that, push atoms apart or hold them next to each other in some way by some covalent bond or something like that. But no, they're definitely, they're not in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. That couldn't happen. Well, but this doesn't take into consideration all of the relevant, interesting ways of thinking about things, right? Philosophy wants to say, wait a minute, you're not thinking broadly enough, right? You're not, if you're thinking just in physics terms, and you're only talking about things of the same kind, things like atoms, then okay, yeah, maybe you're onto something, right? But different things can definitely be at the same place at the same time and fully coincident, right? It seems like, so a lump of clay is definitely distinct from a statue by Leibniz's law, right? Because a lump of clay has different what's called existence conditions, right? A lump of clay comes into existence as soon as you lop the lump off or dig the lump up out of the ground, right? You put it together and you got that lump of clay. Um, Maybe the lump of clay ceases to exist when you like cut it in half and you create two new lumps of clay. But a statue is a wholly different thing. It's in a sense made up of a lump of clay, but it's got a particular form. It's got a particular shape. If you change the shape of the statue, you've changed the statue. You've got a different statue on your hands, right? So it seems like by Leibniz's law that there's got to be two things here, and it seems like they're both physical objects, and they both occupy the same region of space. The issue here is, in some sense, though, that they're just described in different ways, right? The clay is thought to constitute the statue while the statue exists. The clay is in a special relationship to the statue. And so while the statue persists over time, the clay is constituting the statue, and the clay can persist over time at the same time as well, is in the same place. So maybe this is less of a problem, right? We've got two different things of different kinds, right? Like, clay lump is not the same kind of thing as a statue. So as long as there's this constitution relation, maybe, endurantism is fine. Three-dimensional objects, they can be at the same place at the same time. But as long as they're different in kind, then it doesn't seem like it's a problem. Well, not so fast. The second case kind of comes in to shift things up and bite the Endurantist in the butt here. So let's take the case of the cat Tibbles. So Tib and Tibbles at time t1 are not the same thing. At time t1, we've got Tibbles, the whole cat, tail and all, and this mostly co-located object that we're going to call Tib. Now, Tib is a thing that is made up of, all of the same parts as Tibbles, except the tail. So imagine, we've got, if I look at Tibbles, I can sort of mentally pick out Tib. Right, by what I'm picking out is Tibbles without the tail. So at time t1, Tib is a proper part of Tibbles. That's a proper part is a part that doesn't fully exhaust all of Tibbles' parts, and so it's not identical with Tibbles, right? Because Tibbles has a tail and Tib doesn't have a tail. So we've got two different co-located things. Now here's a time lapse of the life of Tibbles. So at time t1, right, we've got Tib and Tibbles that are co-located in a way, but Tibbles is clearly bigger than Tib because Tibbles has got a tail and Tib doesn't. But at time t2, Tibbles loses its tail, right? Tibbles loses its tail, and then at time t3, the tail is long gone. Now, question. So here's the kind of puzzle, right? At time t1, Tibbles and Tib are not identical. They don't even exist in the same spatial area, because Tibbles is bigger than Tib. Tib doesn't include the tail. At time t2, though, Tibbles loses his tail. But survives, right? It's not the case that somehow Tibbles stops existing. Cats can lose their tail. They lose their tails all the time. They don't cease to be the cat that they are. Tibbles didn't die when Tibbles lost his tail. But it seems like nothing happened to Tib, right? Tib didn't have a tail to begin with. And so at time t2, nothing has happened to Tib, whereas for Tibbles, Tibbles has lost his tail. Now at time t3, once the tail is completely gone out of existence, has been obliterated, it seems that Tib and Tibbles occupy the same region of space. And so now it seems like we have two things of the same kind that are co-located, right? Tibbles and Tib, because at time T1 they aren't identical, it's not possible for them to somehow like morph into something that is now identical. They haven't they can't be identical, right? At time T1, Tibbles had a tail, Tib did not, and that makes them even at time T3 distinct. This is another Leibniz's law argument, right? At time T3, it is true of Tibbles that at time T1, Tibbles had a tail. It is not true of Tib at time T1 that Tib had a tail. And this is all, I'm talking at time T3. So these properties of these different of Tib and Tibbles are distinct. So now it seems like but part of the issue here and why this is an issue from earlier is that, well, wait a minute, both Tib and Tibbles are cats, right? Tibbles is at time T1 is a whole cat, and Tib is a cat without a tail, right? And then at time T3, we've got now Tibbles being a cat without a tail, and Tib being a cat without a tail. And it seems like they're perfectly co-located. They're completely in exactly the same physical region of space. So what gives, right? Now we've got an issue. It seems like we have, where one thing seemed to be two things that are of the same exact kind that are co-located, right? So now this differs from the clay and the statue case, because in the clay and the statue case, we're thinking like, well, okay, fine, maybe there's two different things there, but the statue is made up of the clay, and so there's this extra special relation that holds between the statue and the clay. But now you don't want to say that the cat Tibbles is made up of the cat Tib, right? It's not somehow like one cat makes up another cat. That would be crazy. Like, it's not, there's that's just not how it is. But somehow we've got these two different things that are in the same place. Do we have to admit that it's possible for these two things to be in the same place? And even worse, if it is possible, is it true that we've got lots of cats that are located where Tibbles is, right? So like, what about, so we've got Tib, who's Tibbles at T1 without the tail, but what about like Ibbles, who's Tibbles at time T1 but without ears, or Tibble, who's Tibbles at time T1 but without whiskers, and or Bubbles, right, who's Tibbles at time T1 but like missing a back leg. Do all of these things exist in some way, co-located mostly with Tibbles? And if if Tibbles accidentally starts to lose properties, lose limbs or whiskers or ears, is it somehow the case that Tibbles comes to be co-located with each of these new cats? Well, maybe, right? It seems like we've backed ourselves into a kind of corner here, worrying about material constitution. But it's an interesting question whether or not the coincidence problem, whether or not the fact that, or the thought that there are two things located where it seemed like there was only one thing, it's not entirely clear that this is actually a huge problem for Endurantism. Remember, Endurantism just says that material objects are wholly located in 3 dimensions at different times. And that might be fine, right? When you talk about Tibbles, you're talking about Tibbles. You're talking about Tibbles here and now. You're not talking about Tib here and now. And so even if Tib is co-located with Tibbles, when you're talking about Tibbles, you're talking about Tibbles, the whole thing, the whole caboodle. And even if it's the case that Tibbles, after Tibbles loses its tail, that you're talking about, when you're talking about Tibbles and it's lost its tail, that, even if it's the case that Tib and Tibbles are co-located in exactly the same place, it's still the case that you're talking about Tibbles when you're talking about Tibbles, right? Because you can still say true things about Tibbles, like that at one point Tibbles had a tail. And that's not something that's true of Tib. So when you're talking about Tibbles, you're talking about Tibbles, right? You're not talking about Tib just because you're looking at Tibbles and talking about Tibbles, and Tib and Tibbles are totally co-located. So it seems like, in a sense, we can also like separately talk about the clay and the statue, even when both exist at the same time, right? If I say at the time when the clay and the statue are co-located, I can say things like, "Oh, that's a nice piece of clay." I can also say things like, "Oh, that's a nice statue," and by those things, I'm not talking about the same thing. I'm not talking. I'm talking about different things. If I'm saying a piece of clay is nice, I might be talking about very different properties of the clay, right? I might be thinking like, "Oh, I like the consistency of that clay." Whereas if I'm talking about a nice statue, I might be thinking like, "Oh, look, I like the shape of that statue." I wouldn't say I like the shape of that lump of clay, right? I mean, that's because the lump of clay gets put into the statue, and I might not say I like the consistency of the statue, because consistency is not the kind of thing that statues have. It's the stuff that statues are made of that has a particular consistency. So Endurantism, at the very least, if the problem of coincidence is a problem for Endurantism at all, it seems like it might be able to sidestep this problem. And it might just be that in the end, it's totally possible for two physical objects to coincide at the same time, or more. But aren't there's got to be some remaining problems for Endurantism, right? I mean, in a sense, we still have no idea on the Endurantist view what it is for a certain kind of thing to persist through time, right? Like, we don't know, like Endurantism just hasn't given us any information about what it is that makes me the same person now as when I was a little kid. And it hasn't told us about how I change over time. Similarly, it hasn't given us anything yet about the ship of Theseus. So we still haven't solved the original puzzle, right? Like, which ship is the original ship? Which ship is the ship of Theseus? So at the very least, Endurantism as a view hasn't gotten us very far. It has gotten us a little bit of a place to start, right? When we're thinking about, okay, well, what is it for a physical thing to persist over time? Well, it's for it to be a three-dimensional object that exists at one time and then exists at another time. And that's what it is for it to persist. Well, okay, so that's really simple, and that's a good start. But we need more, right? We haven't gotten far enough yet. What about other options? Maybe there are other views that we could hold to that aren't endurantist and that do better and solve these puzzles for us. They do more for us. Could we possibly find one? And there is a rather popular second option, even though it's somewhat unintuitive. And this view is called Perdurantism. Perdurantism is also called four-dimensionalism. So you can think of Endurantism as a form of three-dimensionalism and Perdurantism as a form of four-dimensionalism. Perdurantism says that material objects perdure, and that's what it is for them to persist through time. And what it means to say that material objects perdure is to say that material objects are not three-dimensional objects at all. Material objects are four-dimensional objects that have temporal parts and are extended in time as well as in space. The basic idea is that a material object doesn't just exist in the now. A material object is, if it's going to be something that exists over time, it is something that is extended over time. So according to the Perdurantist, there's a difference between these two objects, Kyle now and Kyle, right? So me now and me. Me now is not me, right? Me now is a time slice of me. Me now is me at this instant, but me, what Kyle is a four-dimensional space-time worm that stretches from the moment that I was born, or even before that, while I whenever I was conceived, to the moment that I die. And that space-time worm moves through, basically I am that whole thing. When I refer to myself, I refer to that whole thing. When I refer to, my laptop, I'm not referring to the three-dimensional object. I'm referring to the entire four-dimensional object that exists from the time of its creation to the time of its destruction. Here's a little bit of a, image of how four-dimensionalism might work. So these things over here are called time cones, right? Or a light cone. This, if maybe you've seen these in physics, this bottom cone is representing the past. This top cone is representing the future, and right here where they meet is the present. And so at the present time, basically, there's only one way everything could possibly be. But throughout all of this time, right, like in space, I was this worm and I went through space like this up to time now. And then in the future, I will move through space like this. Now, on the four-dimensionalist view, you are never really wholly located at one time. Only part of you is. So right now, you are probably seated somewhere listening to this lecture. And, but, when I say you are seated somewhere listening to this lecture, I'm not actually talking about you. I'm talking about a particular time slice of you. I'm talking about, you at time t, right? Whatever the time is now that you're listening to this. You at time t is not you. You at time t is a time slice of you that is, situated in this particular way with respect to other particular things. You at time t maybe is something close to a three-dimensional object, but you at time t is not you. You are a four-dimensional worm, and the four-dimensional worm is temporally constructed out of the parts, where the parts are the collections of these three-dimensional time slices, right? So you are a time slice. You right now are, is a time slice that is connected to the previous U time slice and will be connected to the future U time slice. And really, what you are is the whole string from the beginning of your life to the end of your life. Here's another sort of visualization that maybe helps see it. Imagine all of space and time is in this big cubey thing, right? And inside of this big cubey thing, right, we've got the Big Bang, and we've got every galaxy, and we've got every puppy, and we've got every black hole. And the beginning of time to the end of time is captured in this big block. Now, within this big block, we've got our planet, and our planet at the current moment versus the past and the future is just through time. We've got our planet like moving, and each of us moving on the planet. And so ultimately, the idea is in this big blocky thing that exists, that is the all of time. There's just all of this stuff moving through time, all in the same way that it would be moving through space. It's just this is a good visualization of it, right? Everything that exists is kind of just worming its way through, and stuff's over here now and stuff's over here now, but everything that exists, came into existence at the beginning of the Big Bang, and then it's got just all these different worm paths that exist, and then at different times, different physical stuff comes to constitute different physical things, right? So at one point after the Big Bang, the thing that now constitutes my laptop was stardust, right? It was stardust, and then it got mushed around. That stardust, was like different little particles of stardust have their own little space-time worms, and eventually they all come together to form, hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and then they come to form, and some of them form carbon atoms, and then they all, collide with one another, and then they become planets, and then, eventually that planet becomes Earth, and then eventually some of the stuff that's here on Earth becomes me and you. And those, all of those little bits in those little worms are currently now, constituting the larger worm that is you. All right. So Perdurantism is a nice and interesting theory of how things exist over time. um, it tells you sort of, that things can change over time too, because it's not saying, what you are is something that is a four-dimensional worm. So really, when we're worried about, you growing older, we're not worried about, the difference between the baby version of you and the older version of you. Those are just phases in the longer worm. And so the change isn't a change in you, because you are the whole worm. So really, there's no change. There's just a change from moment to moment. There's a change from time slice to time slice, but you aren't the time slices. You are the whole worm. You're the collection of the time slices. So the nice things, there's a bunch of nice things about Perdurantism. Um, something that's interesting after thinking about theories of time is that Perdurantism is consistent with the B theory of time. It's consistent with eternalism, which is the idea that all of time kind of exists eternally, and then we're just kind of moving through it. Similarly, the block universe theory of time, which kind of is best or easily understood if you think of time sort of along the lines of this block, right? Thinking of time in a similar way as we think of space, right? We think of time as the start of time and the end of time, and then everything kind of moving through time in a certain way. It's also actually the Perdurantism, and one of the most the biggest philosophical boon that it gets these days is that it's actually consistent and looks like really consistent and plausibly consistent with Einstein's theory of relativity. And so if this theory in the end turns out to be totally consistent with physics, with the best physics that we have available to us, then it looks like it's got a better, a better chance. If it turns out that other theories of time and theories of persistence over time are in conflict with our best physical theories, then that seems like it's a problem for them. So now, how does Perdurantism solve any of the puzzles that we were talking about earlier? Well, it solves the puzzles. It solves the ship of Theseus, the Tib and Tibbles puzzle, the statue and clay puzzle, by claiming that things can be co-located in space for periods of time, but that they're not the same thing, because they're not co-located necessarily at all of the same times, right? They're not co-located in the same worms. You've got worms. It's sort of like, think about this. At certain points, different roads sometimes converge. And then you've got the same road, but it's got, it's actually two roads. It's in the same, it's one sort of street, but it's two roads, right? I think just south of here, there's a place at which, or maybe it's just north of here, there's a place at which the California Highway 1 and California Highway 101 are the exact same stretch, right? At one point, California Highway 1 becomes California Highway 101. It's the same. There's two names for that stretch. That it's the same road. The roads come into a convergence, and then they branch back off at a different place. Well, on the Perdurantist theory, each of these puzzles is going to get solved by claiming that different things can be co-located at the same time, insofar as they are, space-time worms that have converged and then that come apart at different times, right? So the idea here is that objects can share temporal parts. Just as so imagine you've got three-dimensional objects that can share some parts, right? So take my bicycle and take my bicycle wheel. Those they share parts, right? My bicycle wheel is actually part of my bicycle, but the spokes of my bicycle wheel are part both of my bicycle and part of my bicycle wheel, right? So my bicycle wheel shares parts with my bicycle itself. Well, here it's the same kind of idea. It's just that objects can share temporal parts, right? So, the existence, the time and existence of the statue and the clay, they coincide at a certain point. When the lump of clay gets formed into being a certain way, the statue comes into existence and continues to exist all the way until the lump of clay gets smashed. The lump of clay then continues to exist, right? So the lump of clay is this much longer worm than the statue. The statue is this shorter worm that happens to, overlay with the lump of clay when the lump of clay is particularly shaped. Similarly, for the ship of Theseus, right? The idea here is that the original ship was never actually just one thing. It was two things from the get-go. There were two overlaid ships at the ship of Theseus, ship B and ship C, right? There was a time worm that ended, that was just, there was a time worm that ended when the ship of Theseus lost its first plank, right? But really that doesn't matter. But there's this worm that was that B was there sort of all the way along, right? Once the ship of Theseus was constructed, it wasn't, and nobody knew, right, that it was actually going to split in these two different branching ways. But there were two ships there all along, or two ships at all of those time slices. It was always going to be part, temporally, of ship B and ship C, right? The ship of Theseus. So it was there, always existing, right? Ship B is one kind of worm, right? The top path, and the bottom path to ship C is another kind of worm, where the ship of Theseus, in the top worm slowly is like losing parts and they're getting replaced, but then all those parts, they have their own worms of their own, and they all end up like piled in big stacks in this barn, and then at some point all of those start to get put back together into the right order, and then at the end of that timeline, at time T5, you've got this other thing that is put together, and you end up with a new ship, but really it's just a new ship time slice. And then but the ship itself was just part of the ship time slice at C, is part of a worm that reaches all the way back through the ship of Theseus. All right, so now is Perdurantism actually a plausible view? Is this view a plausible view of persisting over time? So it seems to solve some of the puzzles of material constitution, and it definitely seems to solve some of the puzzles of change over time, right? It seems like what you are or something is this space-time worm. And so it doesn't really, it makes sense that, your space-time worm can have different properties at different times, because, it's the whole thing. It's extended over time. And when we're talking about it, we're talking about the entire temporal thing. But is this really a plausible sounding view? And one major problem, I think, with this view is that it makes objects like you and me and my computer and a statue or a piece of clay into a weird kind of event. And it also makes events into weird kinds of objects. And this just maybe seems implausible. So Perdurantism makes objects into events. So think about what an event is. An event is something that takes time. It's something that happens over time. Events, they happen in places too. And they kind of already are space-time worms, right? Think about your birthday party, your last birthday party. Your last birthday party probably occurred in an establishment like your house or a park or at a restaurant. And it started at a particular time and it ended at a particular time, and it stayed in that space the entire time, that location probably, right? Maybe it moved somewhere, but the whole time, if you're thinking about the entire event, it is an extended temporal kind of thing, right? It exists over time, and it's got lots of moving parts. But it's like if you try to think about the whole thing in like as like one big physical one entity, it's already a space-time worm. So we don't really have the problem with thinking of space-time of events as space-time worms. But when I think about or talk about Tibbles, it doesn't seem like I'm thinking about or talking about an event-like entity. I mean, I'm not talking about something that seems like it's extended in time. When I'm talking about Tibbles, I'm talking about Tibbles right now. I don't think that, when I say that, Tibbles is missing his tail, I don't mean to be talking about this large space-time worm. In fact, what is it even to say that a large space-time worm is missing its tail? That's weird, right? Because that seems problematic. It seems like at one part of that large space-time worm, the Tibbles part, the Tibbles temporal part does have a tail, right? And at another time, it doesn't. But what am I talking about? Like, it's weird to think that I can say, if I say Tibbles doesn't have a tail, that I'm somehow talking about a giant space-time worm that exists from one time, starts at one time and ends at another time. It sure really does seem like when I'm talking about Tibbles, I'm talking about a physical object that is in front of me, a physical cat that can meow and move. I'm not talking about a worm. I'm not talking about some event over time. I mean, I surely can admit that Tibbles exists at different times, but I'm talking about Tibbles right now. According to Perdurantism, it doesn't even make sense to say that Tibbles exists at different times, because in a way, it's just all I'm saying is, Tibbles, when I'm talking about Tibbles, Tibbles is spread across time. So it doesn't make sense to say that Tibbles exists at different times, because I'm not talking about Tibbles. I'd have to say Tibbles temporal parts exist at different times. And it's not the case that Tibbles exists at different times, because Tibbles just is a temporally spread out thing. This problem for Perdurantism is called a category mistake. And, some people say that it is a category mistake for this view. Some people say that it's not, but I think it's worth taking seriously that it might be. And the thought here is that if a view makes you say something of one kind, that it's of another kind, that is, if it makes you switch categories on things, then the view seems like it's got to be false, because it's making a mistake. It's miscategorizing the kinds of things that there are in the universe. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there are physical objects in the universe. It seems pretty clear that there are three-dimensional objects in the universe. And it doesn't seem like those three-dimensional objects are events. Now, of course, there are events. And there is something like an event that is the event of my life, or the life of Tibbles. And that thing does seem, I think, like a kind of space-time four-dimensional worm. The life of Tibbles starts when Tibbles starts existing and ends when Tibbles goes out of existence. And, the life of Tibbles is something that, it's weird to talk. You couldn't talk about the life of Tibbles as having a tail or not having a tail, because that thing isn't the kind of thing that has a tail or doesn't have a tail. That thing is a long and drawn out event. So this just seems sort of like a problem for the Perdurantist. If the Perdurantist view makes material objects into a kind of event, and material objects and events just are different kinds of things, then the Perdurantist view just seems like it's got to be wrong. Another issue, or another way of thinking about this as being a category mistake, is this whole view takes the physical approach, or the way in which it's easy for us to think spatially about things, to think about things in terms of spatial arrangements. And when we're thinking about the spatial regions that things occupy, we can think of like the parts of those spatial regions, right? So oftentimes we think about parts of objects, right? So like, I've got a right arm, I've got a left arm. Those are different parts of my body. And we think about that in terms of the space. But can we really think about parts in terms of time? I mean, it's definitely intelligible to think of or talk about parts of objects in different regions of space, but does it make sense to talk about parts of time? Does it make sense to think of me as being constituted by temporal parts? I mean, it's a stretch on the notion of a part. It sort of, puts strain on the very idea. Like, I can understand what it is for a thing to have spatial parts, but I don't really know if I totally understand what it is for something to have a temporal part. I mean, I can understand what it is for an event to have a particular duration and for something to happen during that duration, but is that really a temporal part of an event? Like, is the first half of a soccer game a temporal part of the soccer game? Or is it, just that a soccer game is just an event that endures a certain amount of time? And so there's, there's a duration that is the first half and a duration that is the second half. Or is ultimately durations and temporal parts, are those just supposed to be the same thing? It's not entirely clear. Finally, there's some other issues with Perdurantism that I think don't necessarily sink it, but you might take seriously if you like or dislike this view. One of them is that it seems to conflict with presentism. So remember, when talking about presentism in the last lecture on time, presentism is the idea that all that exists is the present moment. And so, there is no past, there is no future. The future comes to be and ceases, and the past is something that ceases to be, right? All that exists is the present. So if you believe that all that exists is the present, then you can't believe that things are space-time worms, right? Because clearly, there aren't any worms. If there just couldn't be worms because all that there is the present. So Perdurantism may, however, be compatible with like the growing block theory of time. So if the idea is the present moment is like the top of the block and then the past exists, then what you are is just sort of all of the your past experiences, and so you are the trailing space-time worm that exists behind you in time. But the view itself is most at home in the eternalist or block theory framework of time and the universe. And so if those views, if you don't find those views entirely plausible or enticing as theories of how time works in the universe, then you might not want to be a Perdurantist. So yeah, if you like presentism, basically, you can't be a Perdurantist. And if you like Perdurantism, then you can't be a presentist, it seems. Final roundup here. So Endurantism, the pros of Endurantism is that, it's a pretty commonsensical view. But the cons, it seems like it has this weird problem of coincidence, right? Like it seems strange to think that there could be multiple physical objects in the same exact spot, but it seems like we might be committed to having to buy into that. Also, though, Endurantism hasn't really told us what change over time is, so it doesn't make sense yet to say like what it is for a person to be the same person over time. It doesn't make sense what we ought to say about the ship of Theseus, right? I mean, this is a big puzzle on the Endurantist view. It's unclear how we should answer this view or answer that puzzle. On Perdurantism, there's some pros that the Perdurantist view, it handles the problems of coincidence. It says that material objects are four-dimensional and that they coincide sometimes for different temporal parts. They can share temporal parts. And so for different periods of time, worms can kind of like mesh into one another and mesh out from one another. Also another pro, the Perdurantism is consistent with current physics, and it seems plausible that if current physics keeps going the same way, then maybe we have to buy into Perdurantism in the end also. Cons, however, though, it might be the case that Perdurantism makes a big fat category mistake, and that's just an error. So it might be that Perdurantism is just confused in some way. It seems crazy in certain ways to think of physical objects as a kind of event. And similarly, that makes Perdurantism not really in line with certain common sense views of time, right? I mean, I think that presentism is a pretty commonsensical view that really all that exists is the present. And that, the past and the future, maybe they exist in some sense, but they don't really exist, right? Like, it's not like they exist now, because clearly now is just the present. So maybe if if what we mean by when we say exist, when we say that the present exists, that just forces us to say that the past and the future don't exist, and so presentism seems maybe true. Next week, we move on, picking up with some strands left here to start talking about personal identity. So one of the things that I think is interesting, Endurantism doesn't solve anything like these problems. It just gives us a view of what it is for an object to persist over time. And so the idea here now is like, maybe we need to add some further theory. Maybe we could buy Endurantism and then add some further theory and build out what it is for a person to be the same person over time. And so we're going to start looking at that. So we're going to start thinking about what it is that makes you you. What is it makes you the same person from one time to the next? So like, and to answer that question, we got to think about like, well, what are you really, right? What is it that you are? What is it that I am? Am I some kind of mind? Am I a body? Am I a soul? Am I some kind of animal, or am I just some kind of brain? Can my consciousness be uploaded to, uh, to a computer? Can I be, is it possible for me to be transported in like a Star Trek style transporter across, from a ship to down to a planet without my body, without me ceasing to exist and coming back into existence or something like that? There's lots of interesting metaphysical puzzles and problems in thinking about personal identity, and so we're gonna look at a few of those next week and see what it is that, or what we should think about what it is to exist as a person over time.